Hello and welcome to another episode of Ideaprov. I'm your host, Mike Pedersen. We have a really kind of interesting topic today. It's a little bit out there, but I'm really excited to get after it. I'm here with Megan that I found through a friend of ours, and we had a video chat and really kind of vibed on the same level. Asked her to do an episode, and she was really, completely to jump on board. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say. So Megan, how are you? Introduce yourself, and how you doing?
Hey Mike, thanks so much for having me. This is super fun. So I am Megan. I'm an education nerd. I really love discussing big ideas. When you told me that you had a podcast that blended ideas and improvisation, I was like, whoa, totally my jam. So I knew that I really wanted to do this with you. But yeah, so my life is mainly in education technology, but I spend my spare time in COVID world sewing face masks and taking my dog for long walks in the wilderness to keep myself sane. It's awesome.
Long walks with dogs in the wilderness can't be beat. I don't have a dog, but I think it would be an awesome thing to do. It's one of those kind of bucket list items when I get old. So I want to bring Megan in because she really kind of gets involved with some kind of neat things. So Megan, what's been your passion, your thing that you've really kind of been about over the last little bit?
Yeah, I'm really excited to share this with you actually, because it's such a cool project that I'm really stoked to be a part of. But my whole shtick in education is all about experiential learning. So giving people the opportunity to learn through experience. And one of the projects that I'm working on, which has been really fun and exciting, is a project that I'm doing through my work with Northeastern University and the city of Boston. And we're running a virtual internship program for them, or part of it. So they run an internship program every summer. And because of COVID-19, a lot of their learners or their interns couldn't necessarily complete all of their hours at their location. So some of those hours needed to be supplemented with some kind of virtual programming. So I got to design their virtual program, and they're working on some really neat, impactful projects. They're doing project learning for 10 to 15 hours a week. And some of the projects that we've come up for them are social impact stuff. So they're working on projects that help improve democratic outcomes, like getting people to register to vote, or looking at social bias in some products that exist in our world and how those can be improved. And the projects themselves that they're working on, they're coming up with, these actual tangible products. So for democratic engagement, they're creating a poster to help certain districts know where to go to register to vote and how to vote. There's another one that's about pandemic health and wellness. So they're putting together a playbook for people to, survive and be healthy and well during pandemic times, which is, a feat enough in and of itself. And it's really cool to be able to work on a project that not only, I guess, you insert some experiential learning into the lives of youth that may not have had it before. So a lot of these youth have been doing their schoolwork online, but not in the same way, in a check the box or show up to your Zoom meeting. Whereas this has really challenged them to think more critically and, form opinions and come up with cool ideas that they can share with their community. So yeah, it's really cool. They actually do their presentations tomorrow. They hand in their final projects tomorrow, and then they present to the whole consortium of, faculty at Northeastern and folks at City of Boston and their locations that they're working at as well, their supervisors, on Monday in a virtual showcase. So yeah.
Wow. How many kids are we talking about, or young adults?
Well, yeah, great question. There were about 130 youth that opted to do this virtual track. There are other virtual tracks that were options. Ours was obviously the best. But yeah, we had 130 youth doing these projects with us, which is, I think, something like 25 or 27 teams total.
Wow, that's a lot. Now, has this happened before, or is this more of a one-off because of the pandemic? I mean, is it a yearly thing, a quarterly thing, just based on supply?
Well, so they generally every summer they'll do their internship, but every summer, generally that internship, which is sponsored by the City of Boston and with community-based organizations within Boston, they will go to their internship for 25 hours a week, and they'll get paid because they go there to do 25 hours of work. But because of COVID-19 and this summer, they actually originally were like, well, we're not going to do internships this summer. And a lot of folks were like, hang on, those internships are super powerful and impactful because you're putting money toward, or and putting money into the economy for these youth. And actually, in fact, they do some research around it, and a lot of the youth use the money that they make in their internship to pay a household bill. So it's impactful to have this program running. So they needed to come up with a way that they could still run the program, but then supplement some of the hours that the students wouldn't, or the youth wouldn't be able to do in the office, because the office job obviously is not the same. You can't get 25 hours of work out of a youth if they're not, helping you out around the office. So we had to supplement those hours with a project.
Wonderful. It's really neat to see these type of things kind of, I guess, organically grow and to be used for good. Like, this is the stuff that I feel like needs more publicity, that people just don't see, don't realize. They don't realize, I guess, people and young adults, the next generation is like trying to do good things. And they all see them like, they're all buried in their phones, and, they're not communicating with anybody, and doesn't know any soft skills and all these kinds of things, and blah, blah, blah. Try and getting that mindset to kind of embrace the new generation and how they're going about things is always really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think, my whole shtick forever in experiential learning is like, that is how you learn those, quote, soft skills, or those like interdisciplinary skills. You have to learn them by having experiences. You can't just like read about how to be a good leader. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you have to do these real life, experiences and projects in order to build those skills. So yeah, not only are they creating something impactful for their community, but they're also building these skills that they wouldn't necessarily build in a classroom or reading a textbook. So yeah, exactly. I think it's really cool to me that I think there's been a big shift in terms of like the COVID world and how everything has adjusted, and a lot of things are virtual. The shift around like how we teach has really started happening, and I'm really excited to see that continue to happen, as our world is shaped over the next few months as well. Yeah,
it's going to be huge. I mean, you coming from the educational background, I think that whole concept of, online e-learning, the way people learn experiential, it's kind of been put in hyperdrive right now. Like, people are going to they're figuring it out on the fly. I know, like, my bonus starter, she starts school next Monday, and all of a sudden she has to go to full online. So you have to set up like a little home desk for her, and with like pens and paper, and is she going to have like a tutor, or what type of material? Are you going to get all the material at once? And parents are just freaking out. But at the same time, I have a even younger one, an 8-month-old, and I'm wondering, it crossed my mind the other day, I said, will she ever go to a legit school?
Like they're saying that this might stay with us for years to come. Yeah, so what is it going to look like?
Yeah, what's it going to look like? She won't hit school for another 5 years. And like, if this thing, kind of goes on, or we change the way, she might not ever she might just stay at home in school. So I was like, it's crazy.
It is wild.
Need to think about.
Yeah, and I think like, I was just going to say, like, the change that had to happen between, when it was declared a pandemic and everything shut down, like in that last couple of weeks of March, there was a huge scramble for everybody to just get stuff online. Like, I'm putting that in air quotes. Like, there's a huge difference between let's shove it online and let's actually design an experience that's really impactful and valuable for people. So that is the shift that I'm talking about, where I'm like, it's starting to happen now. They realize that like when they just shoved it online, it wasn't an amazing experience for people. People don't want to sit on a Zoom call for 4 hours or, a 2.5-hour lecture. Like, nobody wants to do that, myself included. Even like a 1-hour Zoom call, I'm like, okay, tapped out. I need a beer. Thank you.
It's so true. I mean, people thought that you could be able to sit behind a computer, like you sit behind a desk, and it just doesn't work that way. And like, you get mentally spent after a little while. So, great tidbit of information. Is there any way that, let's say maybe the general public could potentially get involved or help with this initiative at all?
That's an awesome question. At this point, we're actually looking at bringing that particular kind of project learning experience to other cities that have other, internship programs for youth in the summertime or throughout the year. So that's kind of an initiative that we're undertaking in terms of like taking it a little bit on the road show, and hopefully some other cities will be interested in taking it on. But yeah, I guess if anyone's interested in doing something like that with youth, please get in touch with me, because I would love to explore that with you, whether that's through your school, your organization, whatever it is, your city, don't care. Like this is stuff that really makes me excited and feel like I'm having an impact in what I do. So I'm happy to have those discussions.
Wonderful. Well, we'll definitely make sure to get the information from you and add it into the bio or the comments or the description of the episode below, so that way you guys can get in contact with Megan and make some even more powerful change in the community. Great. So our crazy topic for today, actually sent Megan quite a few of them, but we want to kind of talk about debt and the economy and how that kind of works. And with the age of COVID and even before that, we're talking about, for example, emerging economies, maybe third world countries, or just companies that, or not companies, but countries that are still growing and heavily developing. And could temporarily freezing all debt for either personal or companies in those economies help them grow faster? And if so, how could that happen? So my first initial thought with this was a resounding yes. Just because I thought this makes a lot of sense. Like, if everybody doesn't owe money everywhere, they have more money to impact to put into their business, they have more impact, more money to feed their families, and therefore can grow faster. Now, on the flip side of it, you have those that might have a flight risk, right? So they're going to borrow $10,000 to start a business from a bank, and you'll never hear or see those people again. They'll board a flight to wherever and disappear. It's exaggerated thinking, but I'm sure it will probably be done because you have some unsavory people. But I'm thinking for the average, let's say, small business owner, if they didn't have hanging debt of $100,000 for their place or their land or their business to get started, and they deferred that for a period of 24, 48, 72 months, 3 years, 4 years, maybe the whole country does it. Like, how much money could they potentially make from a GDP level? And I thought it was quite a bit. Now, I'm missing some holes here, so I'm looking to you, Megan, to kind of like fill that and show me the ropes.
Oh God, yeah. Let's just pretend like I'm an economist for a second. Definitely not. Just as like a note to the listeners. I mean, I'm with you in the fact that when I first looked at this question from before even looking into it at all, I was like, of course, that would make a huge difference. Like, even to me personally, with someone who's carrying debt from my a very expensive international master's degree. That would make a huge difference. But one of the biggest things that came across in my mind, which actually as like a sweeping statement for whether that be personal level, municipal, statewide or federal or countrywide, is that meeting people's basic needs is more important than repaying debt. And that is that in and of itself is an idea that if you can't meet your basic needs, that you should have your debt frozen, is, I think, something that a lot of people have talked about, but it's never really been implemented. And it was really interesting, in the time of COVID, because the G20 actually froze the debt for the poorest countries in the world because they wanted them to have the resources to fund the medical care that they needed to fund in order to fight the virus. So it's already happening in our world, and it's already being, signed off on the line by the biggest powerhouse countries in the world. Like, why can't we do this on a, if we're doing it on that large of a scale, why can't we test this or do this on a smaller scale and see the impact it'll have, even on people in our generation who are carrying a bunch of student loans. There's like a whole bunch of stats that I've looked up that I'm going to throw your way eventually, but you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on, especially because you look at the wide variety of things in regards to finances and debt, right? And so here in the United States, they always say, oh, we're not going to, we don't want to increase the national debt, and it's something like $5.7 trillion. And I'm like, where are we ever going to get this money? We're never going to repay this. Like, what is the point of attempting to try and repay this when it's not going to happen? Like, it's this cyclical thing. It's not like any other country or is just going to magically say, we're going to stop shipping goods, services, and export everything to you until you repay us all our money. Like, it's not going to happen. Like, the global economy is way more, in flux than that. And so this concept of debt it boggles my mind, because I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Is if you're in a developing country and you don't have food, water, shelter, whatever, you don't care that you owe the next guy $20. Like, you're trying to figure out your next meal. And the inability for some, I guess you could say executives, higher ups, these world economists to not see that and to say, hey, no, you still owe $20. Like, it's extremely disconnected from the humanity portion of it. And to get people to believe in humans is a different conversation.
It's so hard because we live in this very capitalist society. And so when we're living in capitalism, debt is just a byproduct of that. And so, we are sold this idea that if we invest in things, like education or a car or a house, by being essentially in debt to do those things, then our economic outcome later in life would be greater. But is that true? I'm going to be paying off my ridiculous student loan for many years to come. And that money every month could actually go to something that could improve my life right now. Maybe in 10 years it'll feel great, but for the next 10 years it's going to feel kind of crappy.
Yeah, for sure. It feels like you're never going to get out of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, how many other things in your life have you put on hold because of the fact that you have this massive hundreds of dollars that are coming out of your account every month because of the fact that you're, quote unquote, air quotes here, to go get an education. Like, you're supposed to get these things to better off, to make yourself better off. And of course, on the other side, there's a lot of people that say, oh, well, you don't need an education. You don't need to go do those things, go get some experience. And actually, just like the episode that I dropped today was about that dynamic, about how that could be a little bit better. But I still think it's out of balance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we could probably talk for 4 hours about student loans, because that's just a whole other basket of eggs that I would love to get into. But if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more, there's a great 20-minute episode or 30-minute episode by Hassan Minhaj. He does the Patriot Act on Netflix, and he does one on student loans, and it's really interesting. So if anyone wants to dig into that, that's the place to go. But I mean, debt in general, there's what was it? Some stats that I looked at. 39 million U.S. adults have been carrying credit card debt for almost 2 years, or at least 2 years, sorry. And another 8 million of them can't recall how long they've been in debt for. And a quarter of them expect to die in debt. Never pay it off.
This is blowing my mind. I mean, because if it's what, the second biggest debt, or the number one, I believe, among generation, I think it's the millennial generation and Generation X, is student loan or credit cards. At the end, it's now part of it I have to say is on the individual, right? the decisions that people make, whether it's to keep up with the Joneses or buy things that they shouldn't buy. So there's part of it that's definitely a financial education piece.
Oh, I fully agree with you there. Yeah,
there's better ways to do it.
Yeah.
Better ways to go about it. However, with that being said, do I also think that we need the astronomical interest rates on whatever we might take a loan out on?
Well, and I think the other thing is, there's so many people that are living so close to the edge of poverty. It's like one major, and especially I'm Canadian, so I don't have this medical bills problem, but if someone in the States were to fall ill, that would easily put them in the deep end of debt that they could never recover from. And with so many people living close to the edge like that, and now we're in a pandemic, plus credit card rates being high, it doesn't matter that unemployment's improving. There's still so many people who can't meet their basic needs with the money that they're making. So then they go into debt in order to try and meet their basic needs. And then it's just a cyclical problem where we just have more and more debt. Don't even get me started on this whole national or federal debt. I don't understand how you can run an economy that's trillions of dollars in debt. Is that money's not real? Come on.
Yeah, it's just not real. And then when it's not really, hey, you know what? Let's just print some more. Everything will be fine.
Right, and then
they talk about inflation, and it's I get it, but I feel like a lot of it can be solved with common sense. Now, I'm sure there's a billionaire somewhere that's oh, blah, 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 radicals just don't want to pay anybody. And I'm but like you talked about, if you don't have those basic needs met, it's not going to work. And then you combine that with the fact that over the past, I think it's 70 years, the top 1% of Americans have made 240% more than they did 70 years ago, while the average American now is strapped with credit card debt, and 70% of them live paycheck to paycheck and haven't got any significant raise for any length of time. And it's kind of how do we get out? So in freezing this debt, the vision for my head went to, if I'm a family of four, which debts do we want to look at freezing and probably making the most impactful? I would assume probably rents and mortgages, because that's the biggest chunk. But will that have a trickle effect throughout the rest of the economy in a negative way?
Well, and that's the really interesting thing that we're seeing that's happening right now in terms of coronavirus and COVID-19 response, is that a lot of people were calling for a rent freeze. And I agreed with it. But then thinking about it, it's okay, well, if those people can't pay their rent, then their landlords can't pay their mortgage. And then when mortgages can't be paid, guess what happens? A huge recession. That happened in 2008. That's what happened. People didn't pay their mortgages. People were lent a whole bunch of really crappy debt, and this whole house of cards fell down. So there's just, that's my, I'm gonna sound so socialist, but that's my huge problem with our capitalist society, is that it's all built on this house of cards of people relying on the lowest levels of people to support them. So these major corporations rely on the labor of really low wage workers in order to run their billion-dollar business. And it's just at the detriment of those people at the bottom of the ladder, because they are scraping by with their minimum wage, and their hard labor and effort gives these owners, like you said, the extra 250% in the past 70 years because of all this cheap labor. And if folks can't meet their basic needs with minimum wage, there's a problem there. That's a fundamental problem in the way that we run our economy and our country. I haven't done a lot of research into universal basic income, but I think it's a big thing that we should look at, because if in Canada we have something called, I call it CERB, but apparently it's CERB, CERB, which is the COVID Emergency Relief Benefit. And it was set up by our government to give Canadians $2,000 a month, every month for, I think it was 6 months. So it was you're covered, you're cool, we're going to give you essentially a universal basic income. We're going to give you a benefit every month if you're furloughed or your job is lost due to COVID-19. And my husband was furloughed. So for us, it was like, great, we have this we can rely on. But the problem is that universal basic, or that CURB payment or CERB payment was higher for some people than their actual minimum wage job.
Wow.
Why is that a thing that we're doing? Like, why,
I can see that being an issue.
Like, why would people want to go back to work if their benefit payment is higher? Like, that makes no sense. So, yeah, I'm really interested in how basic needs are better met, and I'm really interested in how that can impact debt overall, because I think a lot of debt comes down to people meeting basic needs. I don't think a lot of debt is related to, overspending. I think there's a little bit. I think you're right in that, like, there's a lot in terms of like financial education. There's a huge piece there in terms of like how we can better set up our curriculums to teach students how to manage money, because that was never something we ever had in school. I really wish we had, because I got cornered in a grocery store when I was 18 and they're like, you can have a grocery store credit card. I was like, amazing. They're like, here's a limit of $1,000. I was like, cha-ching. And then like, spent 2 years paying that off on my minimum wage job. So it's like, there's a little bit there in terms of education for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a good part of education, because I remember my first year of college, there was a guy that went around with a clipboard in the dorm, and he was like, hey, do you want to open like a Citibank account, like $1,000 and you get a free t-shirt? And I'm like, free t-shirt? What? It's like, yeah, give me a free t-shirt. I still have the shit. It just says like college on the front. It's fantastic. But of course, I was lucky enough my dad kind of schooled me on some financial education stuff. And he was like, this is how credit works. And he taught me all about that stuff. So literally probably like a week after, I went ahead and canceled the card. I was like, I'm never going to use this. I don't want to use it at 20% APR or whatever the case. And I never did. I just got the free t-shirt for free. Great. But I'm also thinking about, from just a quick jump back nugget on the financial education, is like in high school, we had a class called Senior Survival that was supposed to teach you like the basics of, how to cook for yourself and how to do these kinds of things and what voting is like. And I remember one of the things was, this is, dating myself here, but early 2000s. And so one of the things was, hey, how to balance a checkbook.
Oh my God.
I'm like,
amazing.
Who still has a checkbook?
Weirdly, I still do. But yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay.
Never balanced it. Never balanced it. I don't know what that means. Yeah.
And but I think that the fundamental, piece here is, and you touched on one of the things and how it rolls up to the big banks. So this is a more theoretical edge to it. Is do we think that those large bank executives legitimately understand that these low-level income workers that are working paycheck to paycheck, do they think that that's the best model? Do they not care if that's the best model? Or are they just saying, hey, this has worked so far and we've made us X amount of money? Because in my mind, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to try and make your living off of the backs of people that are so close to the end.
Oh, but that exists so prevalently in our society. It's horrible.
I guess it's capitalism.
Yeah, but it's like if you look at like those like what are those stores that you like go to and like you get a little loan before payday loan stores and stuff like that? That is their model. They will drag you for every last cent for the next 10 years if they can. So, I would love to live in a world in which people don't make money off the back of the lowest workers in our society, but unfortunately that's exactly what happens, and that's exactly how our society is built and has been built forever. Like America was built off the back of slaves. Like this is like, how do we move away from that model is what I'm trying to say. Like there's so much we can do with the things that we have at our disposal. And I think that, I even think about like the debt that I carry, which is like student loan debt, a little bit of credit card debt, and like my car payment. And like, because I had a car payment, last year we bought a car when we moved back to Canada, and like within a week, within like one day of my first car payment that like came out of my account, the bank that I did my car loan through called me and was like, hey, you're in good standing. Do you want a line of credit? And I was like, are you totally nuts? Like, I already owe you many thousands of dollars for my car. Like, the last thing I need is to be in more debt. So it's like almost their, MO to like go and, get people in more debt. It's like, man, this is not the only way you guys can make money.
Yeah, it's like there's got to be a better way, right? And maybe it's not the small guy, maybe it's playing off the medium guy or the high guy. But, it kind of also does rub you the wrong way because you hear about these mega people who rip people off, like the Bernie Madoffs or whatever with the Ponzi schemes and they run through it. And of course, there's a human component, they're just partially bad people. But at the same time, I also have to think if you have that many people on the bad side of things, you have to have some people on the good side of things, right? Some people that are fighting it. And how is it that those loopholes are never closed? Like, those things are never changed?
That would be because...
we've been doing this, like you said, since the time of slavery. We're talking a couple hundred years here. At some point in time, somebody's got to figure something out that, hey, maybe if we plug this little hole, the offshore bank accounts, some people don't pay taxes.
Yeah, but these people have money to fight that stuff, so they pay lobbyists to go and lobby government to make sure that those holes don't get plugged. That's the perpetual problem, is that there's these mega rich people that don't pay taxes and corporations that don't pay taxes. So there's a significant amount of money that's missing from the economy because it's not missing from the economy, but not being like refed back into the economy or through the government. Through proper taxation, because assets are being hidden or companies get write-offs or whatever it is. And so that is a trickle-down effect, because then it means that our tax rates need to get higher because the corporations aren't paying their fair share. So then the fair share for the people who earn minimum wage is way higher than it probably should be, in order to meet your basic needs. It's just this like really annoying cyclical thing. We have this saying in my household, because both my husband and I came from, middle class families. Like, we weren't well off, but we weren't poor off, but we're working class. So we have this saying that we say is like, money makes money. So people who are born into wealth or who have significant wealth, that allows them to make more wealth because they can afford to invest in things that help them gain more wealth. So great example is like someone who's, a teenager who's born into a wealthy family, they can afford to go and do an unpaid internship because they can afford to not work.
Daddy's going to foot the bill, or mommy's going to foot the bill.
And, for the rest of us who need to, pay for everything ourselves, we don't get that luxury. So then we're already a few steps behind. And so there's this total disparity between the way that people are able to access and interact with our world and our economy that is like, kind of like not written or like not really acknowledged often. That there's really, we live in a classist system. There are classes. Yeah, there's the super wealthy people and folks that can afford to do stuff, and there's the rest of us who hang out in the debt zone.
Yeah. The other 99% that kind of hang out, that aren't afforded those luxuries or have to work extremely hard to move up, like a half a class or a quarter of a class into the next one. And I'm looking at this debt freezing thing, and I'm thinking, if you look at it from a personal standpoint, so you look at the family that is of the teenager of one of the 1%ers compared to a regular average working American family. What is the level at which, let's say, that working families' debt would have to be frozen to ideally make the playing field even?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The first statement is that I don't think the playing field will ever be even, because it was already too different to begin with. But I think, you touched on this at the beginning when you said like mortgage payments and rent payments, those significantly larger monthly payments that need to happen. Or even, student loan payments can be pretty significant for some folks too. those kind of payments are the ones that, like, if you're not, I think if you look at depending on where you live, what percentage of your income goes toward rent or goes toward mortgage or goes toward student loan payments, like that's generally a pretty significant percentage of your income. And so, what would it look like for people to have, 20% of their or 40% of their income back for themselves? How would they invest either in themselves or in their community, which is the big thing. We're talking about freezing debt and how that can help economies grow faster. I think that helps especially local economies skyrocket, because if my rent or my student loan payment was frozen, I would be like, great, we can go and like eat at the local restaurant, or like I can go pick up some stuff from the local bakery or get myself a coffee at the local coffee shop. I would reinvest in my community because that's what's important to me. But also, I'm then afforded the ability to do so. It was like one of the best moments that I realized when I was like, oh my God, I can go and get a coffee, buy a coffee for myself at a fancy coffee store, and I don't feel like that means I need to take away from my grocery money this week. It was a great feeling.
You don't feel like guilt?
Exactly. It's like, okay, I don't need to feel guilty about this $4 coffee. This is great. I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I had that same moment a couple of years ago, in which I think I went out to get Chipotle or food or something like that. And I remember after I finished, I had paid on everything, I had ate, and I had walked out, and I just had a moment when I got back in the car and I thought to myself, I did not even sweat about bringing out my debit card.
That moment where you're like, is it going to come back as insufficient funds? Yeah.
Insufficient funds. No, it didn't even cross my mind. I knew I was getting that meal. I was not going hungry tonight. I felt good, But you're talking about that 40-50%. That's huge, because not only is it you're talking about local businesses, right? But then we're also talking about that 40-50% can go towards things that can be helpful for the family. So you're talking about reinvesting in education, potentially buying a more permanent, home, making it equitable to live there. Maybe they need to, to fix the water, to fix the heat, or something like that in the actual home, which can make it a better thing. And not only is that helping the family, but that's also helping another local business to be able to, put food on their plate, and it becomes a domino effect. So all of a sudden you've injected an extra 45-50% of money into the economy just by freezing it for a little bit of time.
Yeah. So one of the things that when all of the coronavirus stuff started, or COVID-19 really started, I watched this hilarious guy who spits a lot when he talks in this car in New York, hilarious New Yorker accent. He was just yelling basically about the fact that instead of freezing mortgage payments and then having them have to be a massive payment at the end of this, because they're talking about freezing mortgage payments for a couple months, but then after a couple months you got to pay 3 months of mortgage payments. That's crazy. No one can do that. So he was saying, why don't you just extend the term of the mortgage? So take those 2 or 3 months and just chop them on the end. So your mortgage term is no longer 25 years, it's 25.25 years. And that actually is not a huge impact. The bank is still going to get their money. It's just going to take a little bit longer, which means that you might pay a little bit more interest over time. But the reality is that in that time, those 3 months that you really need that income, that extra 40-50% or whatever it is of your paycheck, you can use that to meet your basic needs and invest in the local economy, or do things like, fix your heating in your house, because that's important.
So you might need that when you live up north.
Yeah. So I think that the way I kind of envision, because we keep talking about dominoes. So the way I'm kind of envisioning this is there's these massive dominoes that are Federal Reserve and the big banks and stuff like that. And then there's the medium-sized dominoes, which are the people who are landlords or homeowners or whatever. And then there's literally millions of these tiny dominoes. And like, if you screw over the million tiny dominoes, guess what? They knock over all of those medium and then all of the large dominoes. But if you don't screw those over and you just like, tell those medium and large dominoes to just chill for a little bit, not much happens. Like, maybe those upper dominoes rock a little bit, but they're still okay because there's still so much more that they can do with what's at their fingertips in terms of resources than those little tiny million dominoes that don't really have much leeway. And like, that was the depressing part reading these stats. It was like, gosh, so many people are living on the edge constantly. And 25% of people expecting to die in debt, like, that is wild to me.
That's absurd. That is absurd.
I want people to be given the opportunity to not only get themselves out of debt, but get themselves, even like, my sister just paid off a bunch of her debt. And she sent me a message and was like a screenshot of like the zeros. And she was like, these are the greatest zeros of all time. Just so excited to just be at zero. Like, imagine we could, screw freezing debt. Let's just forgive a bunch of debt. Let's get people to zero.
And that's the other part. That's the other side of it that I really feel could be a huge opportunity to be able to invest in it. So you have to think, right? I said this on a different episode. One of my uncles went down to the Virgin Islands, and because he was a doctor, they forgave his debt after like 3 years. And I said, well, yeah, it's phenomenal. And I'm like, why don't we do this for other social or public servants,
teachers,
right? So teachers,
nurses,
police officers, nurses, paramedics, and create a little bit of a bracket system, because if you want good quality people to go into these professions, reward them for doing so. Imagine if all the police officers and the teachers and stuff, they could go in there and say, hey, listen, you go to school, you get your your master's or whatever, and you go teach for 5 years, or you go teach for 7 years or whatever, and all of it's forgiven. You know how many people are going to go into teaching? It's going to be a lot. You're going to be able to come out, you're going to be able to make it now. Teachers should get paid a whole lot more. I think a lot of people, would probably agree with that. That's a different conversation. But to be able to set up all those people for a much improved, better life is going to make a world of difference, not only for that direct generation, but for generations to come. And then to touch on your point about the large dominoes, those large dominoes, the huge banks, the AIGs, the HSBC and stuff like that, they're dealing in the billions, in the trillions. A couple $100 here or there isn't rocking the boat. Even if it's from tens of thousands of people, it's not going to make a difference for them. It's just going to mean that their balance sheet is a little bit lower. But I'm failing to see how that is going to be a negative for anybody but maybe a couple of bank shareholders.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's where this whole capitalist society comes back to it, is that all of if you need to explain to a boardroom of shareholders why it is that their dividends are not going to be where they need to be this year, and they're basically not going to make money, that's the problem, because these are big dominoes and they want to be able to deliver to their shareholders, because then it's this, like you said, domino effect. If they don't deliver the dividends that they need to, the value of their company declines and people don't buy shares in their company, and there's this massive trickle-on effect. So, I'm at this point where I'm is there a way that there isn't a domino situation? Is there a way in which, I really love that there's some degrees that get their debt forgiven. Why? Firstly, why is education so expensive? Is my first question. But secondly,
$300 for a textbook that isn't even used. I won't get started on that one.
I got a whole bookshelf of them behind me. I haven't opened them, never did. Anyway, but the other question is, why is it that there are a significant amount of jobs that people go to, professions that people go to school for and study to be, things like teachers and nurses, that entry-level salary is so low that they're the kind of people who are almost on the edge of bankruptcy because they're living paycheck to paycheck because they're paying off a massive student loan and not making very much money. So it's like, how do we value, why is it that lawyers get paid so much money and teachers don't? You know, lawyers can pay off their student debt really quickly because they make so much money. Teachers can't. Like, why do we value some people more? I mean, now we're going to get really political, but like, why do we value some people more than others, and some professions more than others, and some, you know?
I think you're on the right track. Like, and the first thing, you know, the cynical part of me says we value these professions, i.e. the lawyers and the rest of them, because of the fact that they're able to get those 1%ers out of jail when it's the case.
That's probably so true. And and they're also mostly white men, right? So that's also a thing.
Yeah, it's also a thing. As attorneys, hey, I can get you out of jail, so pay me a whole bunch of money, and I can figure out a way for you to move your money around and do all those kinds of things. Same thing with the financial planners and the financials, whatever. I think there's like you were talking about with the capitalistic, you know, kind of society, there's a propensity to, I need it now, and to not necessarily look for the future with things. And I think that's where that line of demarcation kind of is. You know, we value lawyers because they can protect us from what's happening now, instead of paying teachers who are going to invest in the knowledge and education for our children and the next generation that could potentially take care of me when I'm 60 years old. I don't want to have to worry about that. Like, if it's gone, I don't know if I'm going to live that long, whatever the case is. And that has always kind of boggled my mind, because like, why don't we want to take care of the next generation? Because when you're 80 years old, that next generation is going to take care of you.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on this. I often think about this, and I often draw the connection between that short-sighted view to the way that we run politics. You know, people hold office for 4 years. So why would we look much further than that? If an administration is going to change, funding's going to change, you know, laws are going to change, there'll be stupid executive orders. Like, you know, there's things that we can't rely on in 4 years' time. So I can understand why we're short-sighted. I hate it, because I want us to be long-term, and I want us to think about, you know, what the impact of something like a debt freeze for a year even could look like. Like, my husband's from the Netherlands, and he just like was like, hey, student loan, which I pay 0 interest on, I can't pay for a year. And they're like, no problem. You could freeze your student loan debt for an entire year up to 6 times. And you also pay 0 interest. Like, what the freedom that gives him is incredible. What is it off the back of that government? Not much. Because, you know, what are they making on his, you know, 30,000 euro loan? Not a whole lot. You know, if they were to charge him interest, it wouldn't be a whole lot. So for them, it's, you know, that's giving back to their citizens to allow them to have the income to then go and invest it in their economy. So, like, yes, we know that this works, and we know that it works long term.
Yeah, and it's like, if you're doing these things now, right, and let's say, take your husband as an example, if that's the case and he's able to defer that for a year, right? If there's no interest, there's no anything, it's not like that entity that he owes to isn't going to be around in 20 years. It's going to be around 10 years, even around 5 years. It's like, they're not going anywhere. You're going to get your money, whether it's today or tomorrow. And for whomever is deferring now, there's somebody that's still paying. And maybe there's somebody that's coming off the deferment that is going to start paying again. So I agree with you in the fact that oftentimes the legislature and the political system forces us to be short-sighted. And oftentimes I've looked at it in a different perspective, because I think there needs to be some limits on how long you can stay in office for some of these things. It's just, you shouldn't be able to have a job like locked in when you're 40 and never have to worry about ever losing it until you're 85 and retire. Like, that's it's backwards. Like everybody else has to worry about that but you. Anyway, sidebar. That's like, shorten those things up, and I think it's going to force people to automatically kind of flip the world a little bit and say, hey, like, I'm going to have to think about things differently, because I know I can't just stall out for, like you said, for 4 years knowing that something's going to change.
I mean, if everyone's having, if the majority of people are living paycheck to paycheck, then that we should have the same kind of, what is it, intensity, or like, I don't know, speed around like how we think about things. Like, let's try stuff out, and let's try stuff out quickly. Let's not try something out and see what happens in 4 years' time. Let's try it now and test it. I think there's a lot to be said in the way that our governments can actually support the people that are within them. And I think that there's a lot that they do to support citizens, but I think there's a lot more that they do to support corporations. And yeah, I think I'm with you in that I almost feel like that I think you were saying before, like, that's backwards. Like, let's think about people first, because they impact the corporations, and they buy from the corporations, they work for the corporations. So, if we can booster them first, that'll have a flow-on effect.
I just think it's different because of the fact that I don't know, I feel personally that if you were to just take a step back for a moment and say, hey, listen, let me give these little guys a break. Let me give these little dominoes a break for a minute. Let them catch their breath. Let them get their feet underneath them. That you're going to make the money back double, triple fold in a year, 2 years, 3 years. They're going to go out, they're going to buy. They're going to go out and they're going to, reinvest in the economy. They're going to have way more money. They're going to invest in themselves in education and come out with better services and stuff like that. That's going to help bolster the economy in the future. And so I get it. It's this constant trade-off of a bird in the hand versus two in the bush, right? Like, they might do this, or they might just kind of sit on it and stockpile and save. Oh, yeah, okay, that's a risk that you might take, but that $200 a month, is that really killing you, Mr. Big Bank? I don't think so. I think you'll be just fine. So I also want to touch on, like, we got to the forgiving of the civil servants. And I was thinking about it when you said it, but blending that with the income of people on a universal level, does that, I guess, how am I trying to word this? Does that make the concept of freezing the debt null and void if we give people that basic income? Or do you think it could be done in conjunction together?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think because we've been living in this society without a universal basic income and for so long, we would kind of need a blend of it in order to move forward. The thing about, like, debt, like, lending money is never the answer. Like, for banks, for anyone, because, like, especially now, the risk levels are super high. Like, why would anybody want to lend anyone money in this time? Like, it's so uncertain. And because we're in this moment of, like, economic instability, and that risk is really high, we know that if people don't have the money to pay their bills, to, pay their rent, then it's just a cascading event, like a series of events. Like, there will be inability to pay rent, which means landlords don't get paid, which means mortgages don't happen. And, that leads to a whole bunch of credit defaults, a whole bunch of, like, house foreclosures and seizures of assets. And then we end up in this moment, like we did in 2008, where all those big banks who, supposedly were supposed to be getting all this money from all these people who they had just, like, lended terrible credit to, end up getting a massive bailout. And then, but but this is the huge problem. It's like, because there is no like baseline or universal basic income for folks, they default on their loans, and then banks can't, say that they're in trouble and they get a big bailout. But who pays for the bailout? It's the people through their taxes. So I failed to see how like our whole idea around like money, supporting economies is really being supported by these big bank or like the big dominoes, because in the end, the money is still coming from those million tiny dominoes. So like, why don't we just set them up for success in the first place?
It's a point that I've thought about myself and kind of gone round and round in circles with, in the fact that with it, in speaking directly to the bailout, it really just kind of doesn't make sense. Like, you're talking about the bank's not going to have money. I find it hard to believe that the $1 billion bank is going to run out of money. It's not. What's going to happen is the bank isn't going to make a profit this year. And I'm sorry, but let me whip out my little tiny violin for the mega bank, because they're not going to make $1 trillion profit. Like, every other business has to deal with this, right? The mom and pop store, the bakery and stuff like that. Hey, if I don't turn a profit, I might go on. So why are we making it so that way the bank is immune to this? Like, okay, bank, you don't make a profit this year. That's fine. Listen, what happens if the bank goes under? A whole bunch of people get to keep their homes. Like, I don't see that as a bad thing. Now, of course, I might not be a shareholder. That's a different thing. So they don't report to me.
But who in those million tiny dominoes is a shareholder, right? Like, they're not. Like, it's those people who already have a bunch of money that are shareholders. So I think, we want to try and preserve the integrity of our economy, even though we don't love the way that it works. We're still trying to preserve the integrity of it. So I think the way that I look at it is that I think we need two things. I think we need like a debt freeze for a certain period of time that allows folks to get on their feet, allows folks to, make smart decisions with money rather than feel like they're in crisis mode. And I also think that we need to really investigate universal basic income, because often a lot of the work that we do as a country, as the way that we support things, is just a lot of stopgaps and band-aids. It's like, oh, there's a problem in our financial sector, so here's a bailout. Oh, there's a problem over here, we're going to slap a band-aid on that. And we're not, thinking the long term. We're not thinking about the long game. It could take a couple of years, it could take a couple of decades, but I think really we're trying to find a management strategy that involves that really looks at everybody's well-being, rather than it being the corporation's well-being. It's about people, and that is so often missed, because even as a person who accesses financial services for debt, I'm likely not a person to them. I'm a number. I'm an account number, I'm a client number, I'm the total amount of money I'm in debt to them number, or I'm the total amount of interest I'll pay on that number, and we kind of forget the human side of it and the impact that it has on the humans that are involved in these decisions. So I do think that there's a significant human side to how these need to be approached, and the impact on a human level rather than an economic level that we need to consider.
That economic level, from that human side, is a big portion of it. But I'd be remiss if this one just kind of came across my head, and it's a little bit radical, it's a little bit out there, and I think we can both agree that, we're probably, people are gonna listen to this and oh, radical socialists over here on the left-hand side, and yeah, take it with what you will. But So when we talked about those big dominoes, you have the big ones of the banks, the medium ones, which is landlords and some people in the middle. And you have those little dominoes, which are all the little people going paycheck to paycheck. So with regards to that, if all of those little dominoes, let's say, didn't pay their rent or didn't pay their mortgage for 3 months, 4 months, what do you think would happen? It's like when you're in class as a student, right? If one student acts up, yeah, you can send them to the principal's office. If all the students act up, what are you gonna do? You're gonna send them all out of class? You're gonna foreclose on everybody's house?
Right? Because then who's gonna buy those foreclosed houses?
Yeah, the bank's just gonna have 330 million houses with nobody to live in them. Like let's really make this a thing. But I mean, it's really a legitimate question, because it would almost be flipping the paradigm on top of its head and kind of saying, hey, kind of almost taking back the control in a sense, and forcing the big banks to say, hey, no, you have to work with us, because if we all stand united, it's almost like maybe a housing strike. Do you think that's even possible?
Well, it's interesting because there still are some folks that are protesting for a rent strike, because they are saying, like, we can't actually afford to live if we are required to pay rent in a time in which we are not making income. So, I mean, it's hard because because of the way that our society is set up, there is a significant amount of dominoes that are in place. So if a lot of people don't pay rent for a significant long amount of time, I think that there's, obviously a big problem, because then landlords can't pay their mortgage. However, I'm not convinced that a short-term freeze won't, in the long term, make a huge impact. Like, if I think about it, there's always, isn't there it's like age-old thing that people are like, you need to have 3 months of income saved. It's like, nobody has that, come on. Are you a working class adult? Cool, you definitely don't have 3 months of income
definitely
saved.
Not.
But thanks for that, rich people.
Top 10 financial tips, like, come on.
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, okay, the people who can afford to have 3 months rent saved are people who own massive buildings, right? Or 3 months income saved. Like, they probably can afford to take the hit for 3 months. But the people who live in that building cannot, because they can't meet their basic needs without that extra money. So it's about, I mean, this is going to sound, again, super socialist, totally left-wing, but it's about, like, spreading the impact. So a lot of the time when these massive, in this case it's a pandemic, previously it was a recession, but when these things hit, they impact the working class economy the most. Because when recessions hit, companies shrink, people get laid off or fired or whatever, and then people are without work, unemployment rises, and it's that working class that's impacted. So I think freezing debt for people like the working class actually spreads that impact, so that it's not just the lower tier folks, it's actually the middle tier that can sustain that a little longer. And so if we can figure out a way to make that impact as minimal as possible on the bottom rung and spread it across the lower rungs or the higher rungs of that ladder, then it's a better situation for everybody. However, as we've said a bunch of times already, in this capitalist world, that's not what they want to do. The easiest thing is to impact that lower level rather than spread that impact across. So it's much easier to be like, oh yeah, in order to save money within our company, we're gonna fire 500 people, rather than say, actually, we're going to furlough a couple of execs, and we're going to cut expenses on the executive team, or guess what, your dividends are going to be 50% less this year. That's a much more difficult conversation than having, a whole bunch of people laid off. So I think that capitalism to me is like being selfish. So like it's selfish to be like, it feels like you have to be selfish to live in this capitalist world, but the selfishness around impact is really interesting, because as much as possible, those larger corporations, those people who have more, want to push that impact off of them because they want to retain the wealth that they have. And the more that they try and retain the wealth, actually, the more wealth that they make. Like, over the past few months, those larger corporations have made the most amount of money, which is insane to me, because the people who are on the front lines risking their lives are these working class folks. So that disparity is already humongous. You know, people who are in the working class are already disproportionately being infected with COVID-19. So the impact is just continually on that bottom level. So that's what I want to do. I want to spread the impact across the whole organization, across everybody, including shareholders, even though that's uncomfortable. Because, like we said before, money begets more money. So those folks who are in that top level of the, I gotta think of it as like a little ladder. Those folks who are the big domos or on the higher parts of the ladder, it's actually not a huge impact on their life to lose a little bit. They'll still have a super high level of living.
Super high level of living, and like you just spoke about, the ability for those, I guess those high-ranking people, those people in the executive boardroom, to be able to withstand a month or two or a furlough is going to be much higher. They're going to be able to come back. They're going to be fine. You know, the people at the bottom was where they're going to have the difficulty. And it would always kind of make sense to me too, and I never understood why this was, is having, if you're a company and you have to make that decision to furlough people, to let people go, to have layoffs, restructurings, whatever you want to call it, why do you want to delay and increase the pain by doing it with the bottom rung of people, in which you have to do it to 60, 70 people, instead of doing it to 4 or 5 VPs or a president or a couple of directors? Like, why do you want to have that tough conversation 70 times versus 3 or versus 4?
Well, it's because the VP hired the management consulting company to tell them who to fire and told them not to choose themselves.
You can do everybody but me.
Yeah. Oh, you can look for holes in the in the organization of this company, but like
not at this level. Not at this level. You know, and I think part of it has to deal with the position and the job and the functions. But let's face it, it seems like once you get higher up, the less contributing or creating you're actually doing. You're making the decisions, right? So, and that kind of brings me to another one with those execs, the concept of the golden parachute, the ability to, when you get, you leave a company or whatever, and you're going to walk away as your severance package with like $26 million.
Oh yeah, the CEO of WeWork, for example.
Like, we're done. We no longer need you, but we're going to cut you a check and walk away. Like, those are the type of decisions that I really have to question where the motivation lies. Because if I'm a CEO and I have to do that, or I'm maybe removing another top-ranking executive, I'll take that $26 million and give it to the other people in the company and say, hey, listen, if we got this money to do this, like, let's give it to this guy. Like, it's not going to benefit us. Like, let's reinvest in what we're doing. Give everybody, $1,500 for a Christmas break or a Christmas bonus or whatever the case may be, or just a bonus for no reason. Instead of giving it to this person, like, where's the benefit there for doing that?
Yeah, so I think that this comes down to the short-term versus long-term impact, where the short-term impact of firing a bunch of people is immediate in that you have, significantly less salary that you need to pay. The long-term impact in terms of our economy is that there's 60 or 70 people that are without income. Then they're now drawing on federal support or state support to get their employment insurance income. I forget what you guys call it in the States. We call it employment insurance.
I think it's just unemployment.
Unemployment. Yeah. So, the decisions that they made for their life, maybe they took out a car loan to buy a car, the decisions that they made for their life are suddenly in the balance because they've lost their job. And so that flow-on effect is actually pretty significant, because there's 70 people that have impact from this decision. Whereas what you were saying before, you just fire a couple of execs and the impact is not humongous for them. And there's nothing that bothers me more than looking at this disparity between pay in organizations, like between the bottom level worker and the CEO, for example. And that's also an interesting thing to look at, because then there's some CEOs who are like, oh, I have a $1 salary. It's like, yeah, but you could get millions of dollars in bonuses and expenses and shares. So
you're not hurting. Stop.
Yeah.
You're not hurting.
Shut it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's the spread of impact in terms of the people that it impacts, but then there's also the spread of impact in terms of the length of time. So the length of, and you touched on this before, the length of time for people in those higher level positions to recover is much shorter than it would be for someone in those lower positions to recover from. We said this at the beginning, you could have a medical bill that could ruin you financially. And I think it's the same thing, if you suddenly lose your income, that could ruin you financially. You could potentially not recover from that. And so, I mean, it's about being fair. Right?
It's about being fair. It's about being honest. It's about being true. It's about making, I guess, what you could say, the common sense decision, right? And to play devil's advocate, there's people that are going to be on the other side that say, hey, well, that person, that executive, worked themselves up into that particular position. They earned their stripes. They did all those kinds of things, and it's like, okay, I get that. However, the amount of opportunities afforded to you being at that position is drastically more than the person that's going to be at that bottom run. So a medical bill isn't going to probably break you. Missing a mortgage payment or not having your salary for a month isn't going to break you. It's not going to make sure that you miss a mortgage payment. And not only to mention, but you're also talking about the network and the impact that you have with those people. So, you have the ability to find jobs faster. Because you're running in a different level. You're running at a different ladder rung, if you will, because you could just reach out to, hell, I used to work with him, such and such and such, and jump over into another executive vice president role or another CEO role or whatever the case may be. And they just stay at that level nonstop without ever kind of doing it. And, to kind of pivot the point, one of the things that you touched on was, the layoffs and the furloughs, going back to that, and the amount of time that it takes. So not just the financial impact of it, but the, I guess, societal impact of it. Why do we consistently think that restructuring, laying all these people off, and then returning and trying to rehire them is going to be the best option? It seems a little backwards, and we're wasting a lot of time if we're, one, going to rehire them, and two, maybe worried about them leaving. But it just seems a little antiquated, and you would think over time that there's got to be a better solution for this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, it's one of the things that time is money. So for companies to, fire or lay off or furlough people to, conserve funds at that particular time. In the future, as they hopefully grow again, as the economy improves or as their position improves, they then need to go through the process of finding, hiring, or rehiring the same folks again, which is a whole lot of extra time and money that they need to go through. So, I mean, it leaves those people in this just uncertain, everything's already uncertain enough. Let's support people the best that we can. I don't know. Yeah.
And I think you're right, in that there's a better way to do it. And I think I might have talked about it in another episode, but I read an article about a year or so ago, and it was about this company in New Zealand who their entire company is built on contracts. So nobody's a full-time employee, everybody's a contractor, and regardless of whether you're there, you just renegotiate your contract on a yearly basis or a 2-year contract. So you don't have to worry about it. And so 60 days prior, you just have a meeting with HR, everybody knows it, and they decide whether you're going to renegotiate your contract and you're going to stay with the company, or you will, they'll work on, hey, your position is being eliminated, whatever the case may be, and you have the ability, and they'll provide exiting services for you and find you a different job somewhere else. And I thought it was a really interesting concept and a take on it because of the fact that life is fluid, and how you feel this year is going to be different than how you feel a year from now. And apparently they did that, they implemented that, and then also implemented a 4-day work week, and the people absolutely loved it. They went over the moon, and production increased by like 80%. And people, they asked them specifically about the termination and, furloughing and leaving and all that kind of stuff. And they said the number one detractor for them that they had an issue with was the uncertainty. They didn't mind if they were going to be let go. They didn't mind if they were going to be furloughed. They just didn't want to be uncertain. They just wanted to have a sense of certainty in what their future would hold. And so I look at that and I feel like that's a missing component, is to just be truthful and honest with the people that are in your realm or scope, and just say, hey, this is how we're gonna operate. This is how we're gonna go. It's gonna affect you. We're sorry. We're gonna help you out, and move on. It's okay.
Yeah, I like the idea of supporting services to help them find their next role. That's really impactful. I think that's a human touch that's often missing, particularly when people leave jobs or are fired or furloughed or whatever it is. It's just like, bye. Guess what? Your benefits are done now, so see you.
Yeah, see you. Today will be your last day. Thanks.
Pack up your desk. You're like, crap. So I'm hesitant around the idea of like contract work, because I think that there's a time and a place for contract work, and I think that there's a lot that a company can do for someone by making them a full-time employee and not a contractor. Particularly if I'm thinking about the economy and things like buying a home or whatever, like, there's a certain amount of stability that you need to prove in order to get credit. Back full circle, back to credit and debt. So if you want to get some credit or get yourself into some debt, you need to have a lot of security around that, because no one will loan you anything if you're a risky lendee. So I feel like we've just come around full circle to this whole like, should we freeze debt? And both of us are like, hell yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit it on, nail on the head. And to kind of like wrap it up and summarize, I'm gonna run down the kind of the points that we have, and then we'll just see if we missed anything, right? So one of the things that we need to do is start to look at basic needs is more important than repaying debt, because I think if we're not comfortable with that fact, it's going to be very difficult to execute past that. Number 2, evaluate some universal basic income, so that way you can give people a sense of security, a sense of stability, and a way to make the ends meet, which will then afford them an opportunity to reinvest in the community on a consistent basis, and therefore in turn keeping the economy strong, right? Point number 3 is look at debt forgiveness for a couple of industries, so namely public servants. So you're talking firemen, police people, nurses, teachers, anything of that nature that would be helpful in forgiving their debt over after they put in, let's say 5 to 7 years, depending on their scale. Forgive their student loan debts or whatever they use to incur those debts to be able to get that education. And point number 4 was want to find a way to freeze the debt for a period of time. So let's say 6 months. This could be in the age of COVID or not, potentially in developing economies as well in other countries, and be able to spread that impact more evenly throughout throughout all the ranks of society. So we're talking the high big dominoes, the big banks, the middle ones, and the landlords, and the low income paycheck to paycheck people. And then we just want to look at maybe a different way to interact with employees when it comes time that the companies need to reassess their talent pool and employees. Did I miss anything?
Oh, I think you hit all the major points. Yeah. I love it. Cool.
Well, that was exactly kind of how I envisioned Ideaprov to be. We got together and didn't have any idea how this topic was going to kind of transpire, and we came out with 3 or 4 different ideas just from talking, and kind of formulated a little bit of a plan that we could help try and make just to see what would happen if debt was freezing. So I have to say a wonderful thank you to Megan. I thought you were fantastic. I couldn't envision a better co-creator for this segment. So thank you for being on the show, and I think we're gonna really make some people think and wonder once they hear this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. This was so much fun. I really appreciate it.
Good. So guys, as usual, we'll definitely put in Megan's notes about her project from the beginning. We'll add that into the description, and then you can always reach out to us at Ideaprov if you want to be on the show, or add your comments, and we'd love to hear from you. You can also check out the website at ideaprov.live at any point in time, and so drop us a line, ideaprov@gmail.com. Let us know of an episode that you want to hear, or any type of topics that you want to go over, and we'd love to have you. So stay tuned for a little bit later, and you'll hear the invention of the week. Hey everyone, and welcome to another invention of the week. I wanted to share this little interesting nanomaterial robot that I found with you from an environmental perspective. So all of us can remember about 10 years ago, BP ended up spilling 168 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, ravaged and completely tore up the environment. And the students at NC State came up with this robot over the last 10 years to suck up oil and not hurt the environment at the same time. So this robot that you can see here, and I'll make sure to put a link in it for those that are just listening, is a solar powered robot. It looks like similar to an old school 1950s top that kids used to play with. And what it does is it sucks up all the oil, completely solar powered by the way, sucks up all the oil and puts it into like this sponge-like material. The sponge-like material is actually made up of leaves and other environmental materials, so it doesn't rely on fossil fuels for that sponge to be able to suck it up. Previously, in order to clean up oil spills, they would just have to pretty much burn the oil off the top. So this is a great way to not have to do that and be a lot more friendly to the environment in the neighboring area. Each particular robot can hold about 20 gallons of oil, and it can also do, I guess, the membrane that holds the leaves and the oil can be redeployed about 180 times before it needs to be changed. So I thought this was a really interesting tool that could be used, because these oil spills and whatnot are still happening on a regular basis. There was one in Russia that was 100,000 gallons of diesel fuel, metric tons of diesel fuel that was dispersed in the Arctic. So I think this is something that we could all use, and definitely helps from all standpoints. So leave your thoughts and your comments on our website in relation to the episode, and then you can also interact with us at Ideaprov at any one of the social handles. Thanks, and we'll talk to you next time.